Welcome back to Sleepless History, the podcast where we take the most extraordinary moments in human history and deliver them to you in the most relaxing, unhurried way possible. I am so glad you are here. Tonight, we are going somewhere that has fascinated historians, scientists, journalists, and ordinary people for nearly 4 decades. We are going to a place whose name alone conjures images of abandoned Ferris wheels, overgrown streets, and the eerie, beautiful stillness of a world that was suddenly and completely left behind. Tonight, we are going to Chernobyl. We are going to walk through the entire story, from the very beginning, long before anyone outside of the Soviet Union had ever heard the name, all the way through the disaster itself, the extraordinary human response that followed, and what the region looks like today, decades after the world's worst nuclear accident reshaped everything we thought we knew about the power of the atom. If you've tuned in tonight to help your mind drift off, you're in the right place. That's the whole reason these stories exist. If you find this helpful, consider subscribing and leaving a comment about where you're listening from and what the time is. I love reading through the comments. There's something surreal about knowing someone is watching at midnight in San Francisco, while someone else is starting their day in Stockholm or grabbing a quick lunch in Sydney. Chapter 1: The City That Was Built for the Future. To understand what happened at Chernobyl, we have to start not with the reactor and not with the explosion. We have to start with the dream. Because Chernobyl, the whole region, the whole project was, in its earliest conception, a dream, a Soviet dream, specifically. And like so many Soviet dreams of the 20th century, it was enormous in its ambition, deliberate in its design, and utterly convinced of its own rightness. Let us go back, then, to the 1960s. The Cold War is in full swing. The United States and the Soviet Union are engaged in a competition that encompasses not just military might and geopolitical influence, but science, technology, industry, and most of all, energy. Nuclear power, in the years following the Second World War, had come to represent something extraordinary, the possibility of limitless, clean, almost magical electricity. The atom, which had been split so devastatingly over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, could be harnessed, could be tamed, could be made to work for human civilization rather than against it. Both superpowers understood this. Both superpowers wanted to be first to build the best reactors, first to generate the most electricity from nuclear sources, first to prove that their system, their ideology, their model of organizing human society was the one most capable of delivering on the promise of the atomic age. In the Soviet Union, this desire took on a particular intensity. The Communist Party, under successive leaderships from Joseph Stalin through Nikita Khrushchev and into the era of Leonid Brezhnev, was deeply invested in demonstrating that socialism could outperform capitalism on every measurable front. Electricity generation was a measurable front. Nuclear power was prestigious. Nuclear power was the future. And so the Soviet nuclear program expanded rapidly through the 1950s and 60s. Research institutes were established, scientists were trained, reactors were designed and built, and by the late 1960s, Soviet planners began looking for places to build a new, large-scale nuclear power station that would supply electricity to the western regions of the Soviet Union, what is now Ukraine, and parts of what is now Belarus. The site they chose was in the northern part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, in a region known for its flat, forested landscape and its proximity to the Pripyat River, which could supply the enormous quantities of water a nuclear facility would require for cooling. The nearest town of any size was a small, ancient settlement called Chernobyl, which had existed in one form or another since the 12th century. In Ukrainian, the word Chernobyl refers to a type of wormwood plant, Artemisia vulgaris, a common, somewhat bitter herb that grows wild throughout the region. It is a humble name for a humble place, a market town, a quiet corner of the Soviet Empire. The power station would not actually be built in Chernobyl itself. The chosen site was about 15 kilometers to the northwest along the banks of the Pripyat River. And here, beginning in the late 1960s and continuing through the 1970s, an extraordinary thing happened. A brand new city was built from nothing. This city was called Pripyat. It was named, like so many Soviet cities of the era, after the nearest body of water, the Pripyat River, that wound through the flat, marshy landscape of the region. And from the very beginning, Pripyat was intended to be something special, not just a workers' dormitory, not just a cluster of apartment blocks hastily assembled to house the labour force of a nearby industrial facility. Pripyat was meant to be a model city, a showcase of Soviet urban planning, a demonstration that the socialist state could provide its citizens with not just shelter and work, but culture, comfort, and genuine quality of life. The city was founded officially on the 4th of February, 1970. In Soviet terms, this made it almost brand new, a newborn by the standards of a country with cities dating back 1,000 years or more. The architects and planners who designed Pripyat were given the opportunity that urban planners rarely get, a completely blank canvas. No existing streets to work around, no historical buildings to preserve, no inherited logic of an older city to accommodate. They could design everything from scratch, and they did. The layout of Pripyat reflected the ideals of Soviet urban planning at its most ambitious. Wide boulevards lined with trees, large public squares where citizens could gather for celebrations, demonstrations, and ordinary life, parks and green spaces woven throughout the city, schools, hospitals, libraries, cultural centres, all the institutions of a complete and functioning society built in advance and waiting to be filled with life. The apartment buildings of Pripyat were built in the characteristically Soviet style of the era large, concrete panel blocks, known in Russian as panliaki, which were the standard form of mass housing across the Soviet Union from the 1950s onward. These buildings were functional rather than beautiful, but they were solid, warm in the bitter Ukrainian winters, and equipped with the basics of modern life elevators, running water, central heating. By the standards of many Soviet citizens elsewhere, an apartment in Pripyat was actually quite desirable, and the people who came to Pripyat were, for the most part, desirable too, at least from the Soviet state's perspective. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which was being constructed a few kilometers away, required highly skilled workers, engineers, physicists, technicians, the kind of people who had spent years in specialized education and training, who were among the best educated members of Soviet society. These were not ordinary workers. They were the Soviet technical elite, and Pripyat was being built for them. This gave the city a particular character. It was young, The average age of Pripyat's residents in the early 1980s was somewhere around 26 years old, making it one of the youngest cities in the Soviet Union. It was educated. It was, by Soviet standards, relatively prosperous. Pripyat residents had access to goods and amenities that were hard to come by in many parts of the country. The special shops that served nuclear industry workers carried better quality food and consumer items than ordinary Soviet stores. The city had one of the highest concentrations of personal automobiles in the Ukrainian Republic. There was a hotel, a cultural center called the Palace of Culture, a cinema, several schools, a hospital, sports facilities, and what was, at the time of the disaster, a brand new amusement park that had been constructed in anticipation of May Day celebrations. By the spring of 1986, Pripyat had a population of approximately 49,000 people. It was a fully functioning, thriving small city, busy, full of children, full of young families, full of people going about their lives with all the ordinary complications and pleasures and routines that lives contain. And at the heart of everything, the reason for all of it was the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Let us talk about the plant itself, because understanding what it was and how it worked is essential to understanding what went wrong. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant, officially designated the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power station because almost everything in the Soviet Union was named after Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, was a large, complex facility designed to generate electricity through nuclear fission. It was built in stages over the course of the 1970s and early 1980s. The first reactor, known simply as Unit 1, began operation in September 1977. Unit 2 followed in December 1978. Unit 3 came online in December 1981, and Unit 4, the reactor that would eventually become the center of everything, began generating electricity in March 1984. The reactors at Chernobyl were of a type known by the Russian acronym RBMK, which stands, in Russian, for Reaktor Bolshoi Moshnosti Kanalny, meaning roughly high-power channel-type reactor. The RBMK was a distinctly Soviet design, developed in the 1960s as an alternative to the pressurized water reactors being built in the United States and Western Europe. The RBMK had several features that made it attractive to Soviet planners. It was large, capable of generating enormous amounts of electricity. It could be refueled while continuing to operate, which increased efficiency and reduced downtime. And crucially, it used ordinary water rather than heavy water as a coolant, which simplified construction and reduced costs. But the RBMK also had characteristics that, with the benefit of hindsight, are deeply troubling. At the heart of the design was a property known to nuclear engineers as a positive void coefficient. Without getting too deeply into the physics, because this is a program designed to help you relax, not a university lecture, this means, essentially, that under certain conditions, if the coolant water in the reactor began to boil and form steam bubbles, the reactor would become more reactive rather than less reactive. In other words, the more the cooling system struggled, the more power the reactor produced, which made the cooling system struggle even more, which produced even more power in a self-reinforcing spiral. This is the opposite of how most reactor designs work. In most Western reactor designs, if the cooling system is compromised, the reactor automatically becomes less reactive the physics of the system work as a natural brake on runaway reactions. In the RBMK, under certain conditions, the physics pushed in the other direction. Soviet nuclear engineers knew about this property. It was documented. It was understood. But the general consensus within the Soviet nuclear establishment was that with proper procedures and trained operators, the positive void coefficient was manageable. The RBMK was considered safe enough. It had operated, after all, for years across multiple sites without catastrophic incident. There were other design quirks as well. The RBMK's control rods, the long rods of graphite and boron that were inserted into the reactor to slow or stop the nuclear reaction, had an unusual design flaw. When a control rod was inserted into a fully operating reactor, the first few seconds of its insertion actually caused a brief spike in reactivity before the rod's neutron-absorbing properties began to take effect. This was called the positive scram effect, or, in the technical language of nuclear engineering, the graphite tip effect. The tips of the control rods were made of graphite, which is actually a moderator, a material that enhances rather than suppresses nuclear reactions. So when a rod was first inserted, the graphite tip displaced water at the bottom of the channel before the boron portion of the rod could reach it, momentarily increasing rather than decreasing the reaction rate. This flaw was known. It was documented in technical reports. Some engineers had flagged it as a concern, but the information had not been widely circulated. Plant operators at Chernobyl and at other RBMK facilities across the Soviet Union had not been clearly told about this characteristic of the control rods. The Soviet nuclear establishment operated, as we shall see, in a culture where information flowed upward reluctantly and downward selectively, where admitting problems was dangerous, and where maintaining the appearance of competence and control was often more important than actually achieving it. These technical details matter. They are not just background noise. They are the conditions that made what happened in April 1986 not just possible, but perhaps inevitable. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us stay for a moment longer in the world before the disaster. In the world of Unit 4 in 1985 and early 1986, which was, by all external appearances, a smoothly functioning nuclear facility producing clean electricity for millions of Soviet citizens. The Chernobyl plant was considered one of the better facilities in the Soviet nuclear system. It had a good safety record. Its operators were trained and experienced. The management of the plant, under its director Viktor Bryukhanov, was regarded reasonably well within the Soviet nuclear bureaucracy. Bryukhanov was a career Soviet industrial manager capable, methodical, deeply invested in meeting the production targets that came down from Moscow, and deeply aware that his career and his standing depended on those targets being met. The culture at Chernobyl, and more broadly in Soviet nuclear power, was shaped by two powerful forces that pulled in somewhat different directions. On one hand, there was genuine scientific and technical expertise. The physicists and engineers who worked in Soviet nuclear power were, in many cases, truly excellent, well-trained, intelligent, dedicated to their work. Soviet nuclear physics was, in several respects, world-class. On the other hand, there was the Soviet system itself, the vast, hierarchical, bureaucratic apparatus of the communist state, with its emphasis on meeting planned targets, its culture of not reporting bad news upward, its rewards for apparent success and its punishments for apparent failure. In this system, acknowledging a problem was risky. Admitting that a reactor had a flaw was dangerous. Requesting a delay or a slowdown was almost unthinkable. These two forces, the genuine technical competence on one side and the systemic pressures of Soviet institutional culture on the other, would meet violently in the early morning hours of April 26, 1986. But first, there was a test that needed to be run. Chapter 2. The night everything changed. In the weeks and months leading up to the disaster, the operators of Unit 4 at Chernobyl were preparing to conduct a safety test. This was not unusual in itself. Nuclear facilities conduct tests regularly as part of the ongoing work of verifying that safety systems function as designed. What was somewhat unusual was the nature of this particular test and the circumstances under which it was being conducted. The test was designed to address a specific safety concern. In the event of a station blackout, a loss of external electrical power, Chernobyl's reactors, like all nuclear reactors, would need to be cooled urgently. The cooling pumps required electricity to operate. Emergency diesel generators were available as a backup power source, but these generators took approximately 60 to 75 seconds to reach full operational speed from a cold start. During those 60 to 75 seconds, there would be a gap in power availability, a period during which the cooling pumps might not receive enough electricity to function properly. The question the test was designed to answer was this: could the spinning turbines of the reactor itself, as they coasted down after being disconnected from the reactor's steam supply, generate enough residual electricity to power the cooling pumps during that critical gap? The turbines, even after steam flow was cut off, would continue to spin for some time due to their own rotational inertia. If their residual output could power the cooling pumps for long enough, then the transition to diesel generator power would be safe and seamless. This was, in principle, a reasonable safety concern and a reasonable thing to test. The problem was the history of how previous attempts at this test had gone, and the conditions under which the April 1986 test was being attempted. This was, in fact, not the first time Chernobyl's operators had tried to run this test. Previous attempts had been made in 1982, in 1984, and in 1985. Each time, the test had failed to produce satisfactory results. The turbine's residual power output had not met the required specifications. Each time, the test had been postponed, modified, and rescheduled. The pressure to finally get a satisfactory result was significant. Unit 4 had been in commercial operation for 2 years, and the unresolved safety question of the blackout gap was an outstanding item that needed to be checked off. The test was scheduled for April of 1986, and it was assigned to a team led by a turbine engineer from the Moscow-based institute that had designed the test procedure, a man named Anatoly Dyatlov, who was the deputy chief engineer of Chernobyl's 3rd and 4th units, would oversee the test from the plant side. The plan was to run the test during a scheduled maintenance shutdown of Unit 4, which would also involve reducing the reactor's power output to a low level somewhere between 700 and 1000 megawatts thermal, which is a partial power level well below the reactor's full operating capacity of 3200 megawatts thermal. On the evening of April 25th, 1986, the preparations for the test began. The shift that would oversee the initial stages of the power reduction was the day shift, under shift foreman Alexander Akimov, a young, competent engineer who would become one of the tragic figures of the night ahead. As the day progressed, the reactor's power was gradually reduced in preparation for the test. And then something unexpected happened. At around 2 o'clock in the afternoon on April 25th, the Kiev grid controller, the authority responsible for managing electrical power distribution across the Ukrainian Republic, called the plant and asked them to hold. There was a sudden, unexpected demand for electricity from the grid, and Unit 4 was needed to continue operating at full power for several more hours. This request put the test on hold. The reactor was held at an intermediate power level, roughly 1600 megawatts thermal, about half its full capacity, for approximately 9 hours. This delay was not planned, it was not welcomed, but it could not be refused. Grid demand was grid demand, and the Soviet system expected compliance. The 9-hour hold had a consequence that would prove to be significant. When a reactor operates at intermediate power for an extended period, a particular isotope called xenon-135 a fission byproduct begins to build up in the reactor core. Xenon-135 is what nuclear engineers call a neutron poison. It absorbs neutrons very efficiently, which reduces the reactor's ability to sustain a chain reaction. Normally, at full power, Xenon-135 is burned off as fast as it is produced, but at intermediate power, it accumulates. And after the 9-hour hold, Unit 4's core was heavily saturated with xenon. This buildup, this xenon poisoning, would make the next phase of the operation much more difficult. At around 11:30 in the evening on April 25th, the Kyiv grid controller finally released Unit 4, and the operators were able to resume the power reduction. The night shift, under shift foreman Alexander Akimov, had taken over. The test supervisor, Anatoly Dyatlov, was present to oversee the procedure. The plan was to reduce the reactor's power to the target level of between 700 and 1000 megawatts thermal, and then conduct the test. But when the operators began reducing power further, the xenon poisoning made the reactor difficult to control. Power began dropping faster than expected, and then, around midnight, there was a moment of operator error. The operator at the reactor control panel, a young engineer named Leonid Toptunov, on only his third night shift independently controlling the reactor, made a mistake. He either failed to properly set the automatic control system, or the system failed to respond as expected, and the reactor's power plummeted. Within moments, it had fallen all the way to approximately 30 megawatts, thermal less than 1% of full power, nearly a complete shutdown. This was a crisis. At this power level, the xenon poisoning was overwhelming. The reactor was barely producing enough heat to sustain itself. The correct procedure, by every established protocol, was clear. At such a low power level, with such severe xenon poisoning, the reactor should have been shut down completely. A full shutdown, followed by a wait of at least 24 hours, enough time for the xenon to decay, and then a careful restart. Anatoly Dyatlov rejected this option. Dyatlov was, by most accounts, a difficult and domineering personality. He had been working in Soviet nuclear power for decades and had strong confidence in his own judgment. He also felt enormous pressure the test had already been delayed for 9 hours, and postponing it by another full day was, to him, unacceptable. The test needed to happen. The paperwork needed to be completed. The outstanding safety question needed to be resolved, or at least formally addressed. And so Dyatlov ordered the operators to bring the reactor's power back up, not to shut it down and wait. To keep pulling out control rods, removing the neutron-absorbing elements from the core, to force the reactor to climb back to the test power level, fighting against the xenon poisoning all the way. Toptunov and Akimov were reportedly reluctant. This was not standard procedure. This was not what the manual said to do, but Dyatlov insisted in the Soviet system. Insisting was often enough. Junior operators did not openly contradict senior engineers. The culture did not make that easy. And so the operators began withdrawing control rods, more and more of them, far more than established procedures permitted to drag the reactor's power upward against the poisoning effect of the accumulated xenon. Eventually, after considerable effort, they managed to stabilize the reactor at approximately 200 megawatts, thermal well below the planned test power of 700 to 1,000 megawatts, but apparently enough, in Dyatlov's judgment, to proceed. With so many control rods withdrawn, the reactor was in what nuclear engineers call a low operational reactivity margin state. In simpler terms, there was very little ability to control or break the reactor if something went wrong. The normal safety margin, the buffer that allowed operators to manage unexpected events, had been almost entirely consumed. It was now approximately 1:23 in the morning on April 26, 1986. The test began. The operators closed the steam supply valves to the turbine, initiating the coast down that the test was designed to evaluate. As the steam flow dropped, the cooling pumps receiving power from the coasting turbine began to slow. Less cooling water was flowing through the reactor. Less cooling water meant more steam forming in the reactor channels. More steam meant less water to absorb neutrons. Less neutron absorption meant more reactivity. More reactivity meant more heat. More heat meant more steam. Around and around the cycle went, climbing, each iteration making the next one worse. The positive void coefficient, the design flaw that had been known and noted and never fully addressed, was now not a theoretical concern in an engineering report. It was happening in the core of Unit 4. In the middle of the night, the power level began to rise rapidly. Alexander Akimov, watching the instruments, recognized that something was very wrong. He ordered an emergency shutdown, the insertion of all control rods simultaneously, which in nuclear terms is called a scram. In Soviet parlance, this was called an AZ5 signal. At 1:23 and 40 seconds in the morning, Toptunov or Akimov pressed the AZ5 button. The control rods began to insert. And then the graphite tip effect, that design flaw, that documented but poorly communicated characteristic of the RBMK control rods, did exactly what it was designed, inadvertently, to do. As the rods entered the fully powered reactor, their graphite tips displaced water in the lower channels before the boron portions could reach and suppress the reaction. Power spiked dramatically. In the seconds that followed, what happened inside Unit 4's reactor core was almost incomprehensible in its speed and violence. Power surged to an estimated 30,000 megawatts thermal, nearly 10 times the reactor's designed maximum output. Some estimates put it higher, The fuel channels began to rupture. The water flashing to steam had nowhere to go. Pressure built with explosive force. At 1:23 and 47 seconds in the morning, there was an explosion. Then, almost immediately, a second explosion, larger than the first. The roof of Unit 4's reactor building, a reinforced concrete structure weighing roughly 1,000 tons, was blown off. The reactor core was open to the sky. The graphite blocks that made up the core, now on fire, were ejected across the facility grounds. Burning chunks of reactor material landed on the roofs of adjacent buildings. A fire began immediately in the engine room of Unit 3, which shared a wall with Unit 4. In the control room of Unit 4, the lights flickered and went out. Emergency lighting came on, the room filled with dust and the acrid smell of something that had gone catastrophically, irremediably wrong. Alexander Akimov and Leonid Toptunov, still at their posts, could not believe what their instruments were telling them. The instruments that were still working, many had gone offline in the explosion, showed readings that simply did not correspond to their understanding of what was possible. Akimov reportedly said something to the effect that the reactor was intact, that the readings could not be right, that a core explosion was not possible. This was not denial in a simple psychological sense. It was something more complicated, a collision between what the instruments appeared to show and what these men's entire training and professional formation told them was possible. The RBMK could not explode. It was not designed to explode. Reactor cores did not explode. Therefore, what they were seeing must be something else. A ruptured pipe, perhaps. A partial failure of some component. Something that could be managed, that could be fixed, that could be controlled. This cognitive difficulty, the inability in those first critical minutes to grasp the true scale of what had happened, would have severe consequences. Because Akimov and Dyatlov, operating on the assumption that the reactor was somehow still intact, ordered the cooling water pumps to be turned on. Workers, real human beings, going about their jobs in the darkness and confusion, went into areas flooded with intensely radioactive water to turn valves and manipulate equipment, trying to cool a reactor that no longer existed. Some of those workers received radiation doses in those first minutes that were incompatible with survival. They would be dead within weeks. Above the open reactor, a column of luminous smoke and burning graphite rose into the Ukrainian night sky. People living in Pripyat, just a few kilometers away, looked out their windows at what appeared to be a strange, beautiful glow on the horizon. Some went to rooftops and balconies to watch. A few drove out toward the plant for a closer look. The radiation they were receiving, simply by being outside and looking at this site, was invisible, odorless, and devastatingly high. Let us stay for a moment with the plant workers who responded first, the firefighters, the operators, the engineers, because their story is one of the most remarkable and heartbreaking parts of everything that followed. Within minutes of the explosion, the plant's own fire brigade responded. The firefighters, led by Lieutenant Pravik, who was 23 years old that night, and Major Telyatnikov, who commanded the Pripyat Fire Department, arrived at the scene and began fighting what, to them, appeared to be a serious but manageable industrial fire. They did not know, could not know, because no one had told them, because the people who might have told them were themselves unable to believe that they were standing on and around the open core of a destroyed nuclear reactor in conditions of lethality that had very few equivalents in human experience. The firefighters worked through the night, pulling hoses, climbing onto roofs, fighting the blazes that had broken out across the facility. Some of them later said that they noticed unusual sensations, a strange metallic taste in their mouths, a burning feeling in their eyes and skin, a sense of heaviness in their limbs. These are symptoms of acute radiation exposure. The men noted them, mentioned them to one another, and kept working. What else would they do? By the time the most heavily exposed of the first responders were taken to hospital first in Pripyat and then transferred to a specialized facility in Moscow, they were showing symptoms of acute radiation syndrome. Severe nausea, skin that reddened and then blistered, a collapse of the immune system that left the body utterly defenseless. 28 of the first responders would die from acute radiation syndrome in the weeks following the disaster. Many more would suffer lasting health consequences. Lieutenant Pravik, who had arrived on his bicycle that night to respond to the call, died on May 11, 1986, 15 days after the explosion. He was 23 years old and had been recently married. We should hold that for a moment. 23 years old, responding to an emergency, doing his job, dying because no one told him what he was walking into, and because even if they had told him, it is not entirely clear what else he could have done. The courage of the Chernobyl first responders, and courage is precisely the right word, is one of the most enduring and humbling elements of this entire story. Chapter 3. The Cover-Up, the Evacuation, and the Liquidators. In the hours immediately after the explosion, two parallel processes were unfolding simultaneously, and they were moving in almost opposite directions. At the plant itself, and in the immediate vicinity of the disaster, a terrible clarity was beginning to emerge. People were being injured. People were being irradiated. The scale of what had happened was becoming slowly, undeniably apparent to those close enough to see it with their own eyes. But in the channels of the Soviet state, in the phone calls and telegrams and formal reports that were making their way from Pripyat to Kiev, from Kiev to Moscow, from plant management to regional authorities to the ministries, and eventually, hours after the explosion, to the Kremlin itself, an entirely different picture was being painted. Viktor Bryukhanov, the plant director, was in his office before dawn on April 26th. He was making calls, receiving reports, trying to piece together what had happened. And in those early hours, the reports he received or allowed himself to believe were severely underestimating the situation. The radiation readings being passed up the chain of command were far lower than the actual levels on the ground, partly because the dosimeters available to measure radiation had scales that simply could not register the doses present when a meter reads maximum, and the actual level is 10 or 100 times higher. The meter shows maximum, and the person reading it may not understand what that means. Bryukhanov reportedly sent a message to Moscow indicating that the situation was serious but under control, and that radiation levels at the site were elevated but manageable. This report was inaccurate, dangerously so. The reasons for this inaccuracy are, in a sense, entirely understandable within the context of the Soviet system, even as they are morally and practically inexcusable. Bryukhanov had spent his career in a system where reporting bad news had consequences, where the bearer of terrible information could be made personally responsible for the terrible situation it described, where the instinct, honed by decades of experience, was to manage the appearance of things before managing the things themselves. were admitting that a reactor had been destroyed, that the worst accident in the history of Soviet nuclear power had just occurred on his watch, at his facility was simply, psychologically, institutionally, nearly impossible. And so the information that reached Moscow in those first hours was wrong. And because it was wrong, the response that Moscow initially authorized was too small, too slow, and too late. This is not just a story of individual dishonesty. It is a story of a system that made honesty structurally difficult and individually dangerous. The Soviet Communist Party had built an empire of managed appearances, and in April of 1986, reality refused to cooperate. Meanwhile, in Pripyat, the morning of April 26th dawned like any other Saturday morning. The city's nearly 49,000 residents woke up, made breakfast, sent children to school, planned weekend activities. The amusement park on the edge of the city was scheduled to open in a few days for May Day celebrations. There were families looking forward to it, children, who had been watching the Ferris wheel being assembled with excitement. The authorities in Pripyat knew something had happened at the plant. The firefighters who had responded were visible. The glow in the sky was visible. The plant itself, just 15 kilometers away, was part of the fabric of the city's identity. Almost everyone in Pripyat had a family member or a friend or a neighbor who worked there. Word spread, as words do in small cities, through morning conversations and worried telephone calls. But there was no official announcement, no evacuation order, no instruction for residents to stay indoors, to close their windows, to stop going outside, to stop letting their children play in the streets. For more than 36 hours after the explosion, the people of Pripyat lived their lives in a contaminated environment without being told what had happened or what they should do. Children played in the spring sunshine. Women hung laundry to dry in the breeze that was carrying invisible particles of radioactive material from the open reactor. People walked to the market, went to the river, went about the business of a Saturday and Sunday in a city that appeared outwardly entirely normal. The radioactive iodine settling on garden vegetables and blowing through open windows was not visible. The contaminated dust on the streets, carried from the reactor site on the boots of workers and the tires of vehicles, left no visible mark. The invisible particles that people were breathing and swallowing and absorbing through their skin left no immediate sensation of any kind. There was nothing to see, nothing to smell, nothing to feel. Just a beautiful spring weekend in a city that was, in fact, being slowly and silently poisoned. The delay in evacuation is one of the most painful aspects of the entire story, and it cannot be attributed to ignorance alone. By midday on April 26th, there were people in both the plant and in official positions who understood that the situation was extremely serious. There were dosimetry readings obtained by people who went looking for accurate measurements rather than relying on the compromised initial reports that made the severity unmistakable. There were the first responders arriving at hospitals with symptoms of severe radiation exposure. There were scientists in Kyiv and Moscow who, as the day went on and more information filtered through, were forming increasingly alarmed assessments. The evacuation finally happened on April 27th, 36 hours after the explosion. By then, a government commission headed by Boris Sherbina, a deputy prime minister, had arrived in the area and was getting a clearer picture of reality. The decision was made to evacuate Pripyat entirely. It was presented to the residents as a temporary measure, Announcements came over the city's loudspeaker system, the same system that had broadcast Soviet broadcasts and music, and announcements since the city's founding telling residents that they should prepare to leave for approximately 3 days. They should take documents, essential medications, and enough clothing for a few days. They should leave everything else. They would be back soon. 1,100 buses, 1,100 buses. A staggering organizational achievement assembled in a remarkably short time lined the streets of Pripyat. Beginning at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon on April 27th, the evacuation began. Families filed out of their apartment buildings carrying small bags, holding children's hands, some of them looking back at the buildings they lived in with the specific look of people who have been told they will return, but somehow sense, somewhere beneath the reassurances, that they will not. The evacuation was completed within a few hours. Approximately 49,000 people were moved out of Pripyat in a single afternoon. From a logistical standpoint, it was an impressive achievement. From a human standpoint, it was the end of a city. The people of Chernobyl, the actual town of Chernobyl, a few kilometers to the south of the plant, were evacuated the following day, along with the residents of dozens of smaller villages in the surrounding area. Over the following weeks, as the extent of the radioactive contamination became clearer, the evacuation zone was expanded. Eventually, it would encompass an area of approximately 30 kilometers radius around the plant, the so-called Exclusion zone, which persists in modified form to this day. Approximately 116,000 people were evacuated in the initial phases in the days and weeks immediately following the disaster. Hundreds of thousands more would eventually be resettled from contaminated areas in Ukraine and what is now Belarus over the years that followed. The displacement of populations was, in purely numerical terms, one of the largest in European history since the Second World War. Meanwhile, at the plant itself, a different and equally extraordinary story was unfolding. The reactor was still burning. The open core of Unit 4 contained approximately 190 metric tons of uranium dioxide fuel, along with enormous quantities of radioactive fission products that had built up during the reactor's 2 years of operation. This material was burning not in the conventional sense, but in several overlapping ways. The graphite moderator was on fire. The fuel was generating enormous heat through continued radioactive decay, and the burning core was releasing a continuous stream of radioactive particles and gases directly into the atmosphere. The radioactive plume from Chernobyl was not a one-time event. It was continuous for days and days. The fire in the reactor had to be extinguished, but how do you extinguish a fire in a destroyed nuclear reactor that is open to the sky? The initial approach was aerial. Military helicopters at enormous risk to their crews were flown over the open reactor and used to drop materials into the core: sand, lead, boron compounds, dolomite. The idea was to smother the fire and absorb neutrons, preventing the possibility of any additional nuclear reactions. Over the course of about 10 days, the helicopter crews made thousands of flights, dropping approximately 5,000 tons of material into the reactor cavity. This was extraordinarily dangerous work. The radiation levels directly above the open reactor were lethal. Pilots and crew wore lead-lined suits as protection, but these suits provided only partial shielding. Many of the helicopter crews received significant radiation doses. Some developed health problems in the years that followed. On the ground, tens of thousands of people were mobilized to deal with the consequences of the disaster. These were the people who would come to be known as liquidators, a word used in Soviet and Russian to describe those who were sent to liquidate or eliminate the consequences of a catastrophe. Over the period from 1986 through approximately 1990, somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 people served in various capacities as liquidators at Chernobyl. They came from across the Soviet Union. Some were military personnel, some were firefighters and emergency workers. Many were ordinary civilians, engineers, miners, construction workers who were drafted or called up or volunteered. Their tasks were varied and, in many cases, extremely dangerous. Some cleaned radioactive debris from the rooftops of the plant buildings by hand, literally using shovels and gloves to scoop up pieces of burning reactor graphite and throw them back into the reactor cavity, working in shifts of 90 seconds or less, because any longer exposure would have exceeded their monthly dose limit in that single shift. These workers were called biorobots, a term that says something rather chilling about how their role was conceptualized. The actual robots that Soviet and German engineers had tried to use for this work had failed the radiation-fried their electronics, and so humans were used instead. Some liquidators dug tunnels under the reactor building to install cooling systems. Some drove vehicles through contaminated areas without adequate protection. Some were simply tasked with cleaning streets and washing buildings in towns and cities within the exclusion zone and beyond the kind of work that, done in a normally contaminated environment, would be perfectly safe, but that in this context exposed the workers to elevated levels of radioactivity. The health consequences for liquidators have been studied for decades and remain a subject of ongoing research and considerable debate. Many liquidators have reported elevated rates of various cancers, cardiovascular disease, and other health problems. Many died prematurely. The difficulty of establishing definitive causal links in epidemiological studies, the statistical complexity of isolating radiation exposure as the cause among the many other factors that influence health outcomes has meant that the full picture of liquidator health impacts has taken decades to emerge and remains incompletely understood. But we should not let the complexity of the epidemiology obscure the human reality of what these people did and what they endured. They went to Chernobyl because they were ordered to, or because they volunteered, or because they were told it was necessary, or because the modest financial bonuses they received were attractive in the cash-strapped economy of the late Soviet Union. They worked under difficult, dangerous, and often frightening conditions. Many of them knew or suspected that they were being exposed to radiation. Many of them received inadequate protective equipment and inadequate information about the risks. And many of them paid a price in their health and their lives that they should not have been required to pay. Back in Moscow, the political dimensions of the disaster were unfolding in parallel with the physical ones. Mikhail Gorbachev, who had become General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union only 13 months before the disaster in March of 1985, was faced with a crisis that cut to the heart of everything he was trying to accomplish. Gorbachev had come to power with a reform agenda. He was the architect of what would become known as glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He genuinely believed that the Soviet system needed to be more transparent, more honest, more responsive to reality. And now, reality, in the form of an exploded reactor, was demanding an accounting. Gorbachev's initial public response was cautious and delayed. Soviet state television said almost nothing about the accident for days. TASS, the state news agency, issued a brief, bloodless announcement on April 28th, noting that an accident had occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and that measures were being taken to deal with it. The full scale of the disaster was not publicly acknowledged in the Soviet Union for weeks. This silence was broken not by Soviet authorities, but by Sweden. On April 28th, 2 days after the explosion, workers at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden began setting off radiation alarms as they arrived for work. Swedish authorities, alarmed and confused, initially feared that their own facility had experienced an incident. When they determined that the contamination was external, coming in on workers' clothing from outside, and began tracing the source, they identified a radioactive plume originating from somewhere to the southeast. Sweden formally contacted Soviet authorities and demanded an explanation. The Soviets confirmed that an accident had occurred at Chernobyl, and with that, the world knew. The international revelation of the disaster put enormous pressure on Moscow. Western governments demanded information. Western publics were alarmed about the radioactive plume drifting across Europe, and it was, in fact, drifting across Europe. Elevated radiation levels were measured in Poland, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Austria, Germany, France, and eventually, to some measurable extent, across much of the Northern Hemisphere. The Chernobyl plume was the most extensive release of radioactive material in human history, and it did not respect the borders that Soviet secrecy had hoped might contain it. Gorbachev addressed the Soviet public on television on May 14th, 18 days after the explosion. It was a relatively candid speech by Soviet standards, acknowledging the seriousness of the accident and paying tribute to those who had responded to it. He also used the speech to criticize Western media coverage as hysteria and disinformation, a defensive reflex that sat somewhat awkwardly alongside the genuine openness he was otherwise projecting. In the months that followed, Chernobyl became, ironically and paradoxically, one of the catalysts for the very openness that Gorbachev was trying to build. The disaster had demonstrated, with brutal clarity, the consequences of a system in which truth was subordinated to appearances in which people were afraid to report problems, in which information flowed selectively and strategically rather than honestly and completely, in which the gap between what was said and what was real had become so wide that catastrophe could fall through it. Gorbachev himself later said that Chernobyl was perhaps the true beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, that it was the moment when the system's fundamental dysfunction became impossible to deny or manage. That may be somewhat overstated, but it contains a genuine insight. Chernobyl did not cause the Soviet collapse, but it accelerated and deepened the crisis of legitimacy that would eventually bring the Soviet state down. The trial that followed in July of 1987 put several Chernobyl officials in the dock: Viktor Bryukhanov, the plant director, Nikolai Fomin, the chief engineer. Anatoly Dyatlov, the test supervisor, Alexander Akimov, and Leonid Toptunov were not tried. Both had died of acute radiation syndrome in May of 1986. Boris Rogozhin, the shift foreman of an earlier shift, and Yuri Laushkin, a nuclear regulatory inspector, were also tried. The trial was conducted in the town of Chernobyl itself, in a converted cultural building within the exclusion zone. The defendants were charged under Soviet criminal law with criminal negligence and violation of safety regulations. Bryukhanov, Fomin, and Dyatlov each received the maximum sentence of 10 years in a labour camp. The others received lesser sentences. The trial was, in many respects, inadequate. It focused on individual human error and individual criminal responsibility, while largely avoiding the systemic issues, the design flaws of the RBMK, the culture of the Soviet nuclear establishment, the institutional pressures that had made the night of April 25th and 26th possible and perhaps inevitable. Dyatlov, in particular, maintained to his death that he had been made a scapegoat for the failures of the reactor's design. There is genuine substance to this argument, even if Dyatlov's own role in the events of that night was also deeply problematic. All three were released before serving their full sentences. Fomin was released on medical grounds, Bryukhanov on good behaviour, and Dyatlov's sentence was subsequently commuted. Dyatlov died in 1995 of heart failure, a condition that his supporters attributed, at least in part, to radiation exposure from his presence at the plant in the aftermath of the explosion. Chapter 4: The Sarcophagus, the Science, and the Suffering. Through the summer of 1986 and into the autumn, the work of containing the disaster continued with a scale and intensity that is almost impossible to fully grasp. The most urgent physical task, once the initial fires were extinguished and the immediate radioactive releases had been somewhat reduced, was to enclose the destroyed reactor. The burning core of Unit 4 needed to be sealed, covered, contained, isolated from the environment as much as possible to prevent further releases of radioactive material into the atmosphere and into the groundwater. What the Soviet engineers designed and built was a structure that became known, informally but universally, as the sarcophagus. In Greek, a sarcophagus is literally a stone coffin, a container for the dead. The name was apt. The structure that was built around Unit 4 was a coffin for a dead reactor, constructed with extraordinary speed under extraordinarily difficult conditions by workers who were themselves at risk from the very thing they were trying to contain. The sarcophagus was a massive concrete and steel structure built around and over the ruins of Unit 4. Construction began in the summer of 1986 and was essentially complete by November 14th, 1986, remarkably, fewer than 7 months after the explosion. This was an engineering and logistical achievement of the first order. Building a structure of this size and complexity over an intensely radioactive ruin in just 7 months required the mobilization of enormous resources and the willingness to expose construction workers to significant radiation doses. The sarcophagus was built quickly, and because it was built quickly, under desperate circumstances, it was not built to last. The structure that was completed in November of 1986 was never intended to be a permanent solution. It was designed to be sufficient for a period of years, long enough for a permanent solution to be developed and implemented. The engineers who built it knew its limitations. They documented them. They assumed that within a few years, a better structure would be designed and built to replace or reinforce it. A few years became many years. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The newly independent Ukraine inherited the Chernobyl site and all of its associated problems, including an aging, deteriorating sarcophagus that was beginning to show serious signs of structural weakness. Over the following decades, cracks developed in the concrete. The roof sections, which had been assembled from existing structural elements of the reactor building rather than purpose-built, were corroding. There were concerns about the stability of the entire structure. There were concerns about what was inside it. Inside the sarcophagus, beneath the concrete and steel, the remains of the reactor core were still there. This material was not inert. It was not safe. It was still intensely radioactive and would remain so for decades and centuries to come. The fuel-containing masses that had formed during and after the explosion weird, glass-like formations of melted fuel and structural material that had flowed together in the heat and then solidified, were distributed throughout the ruins of the reactor building. These formations, which became known by the haunting nickname lava, or sometimes elephant's foot, for the shape of one particularly notable deposit, contained highly radioactive material in configurations that were not always well understood. One formation, the actual elephant's foot, a mass of corium, was discovered in a lower level of the reactor building in December of 1986. The radiation levels directly adjacent to it in the months after the explosion were so extreme that a few minutes of exposure would have been fatal. A Soviet robot sent to photograph it malfunctioned after about an hour. Over the years, the international scientific and engineering community maintained an uneasy watch over the sarcophagus and its contents. Inspections were conducted when possible, though the interior of the structure remained, in many areas, inaccessible because of radiation levels. Studies of the fuel-containing masses were carried out with long-range instruments, and sometimes with direct but very brief human access. There were also ongoing concerns about the groundwater under the site. Some of the radioactive material from the explosion had been deposited in the soil around the plant. There were fears that this material might be migrating downward through the soil and into the aquifer, which could contaminate water supplies for a wide area. Extensive monitoring systems were established to track groundwater contamination. The picture that emerged was concerning, but not catastrophic contamination was present, but its migration was slower than the worst-case fears had suggested. The 3 remaining operating units at Chernobyl Units 1, 2 and 3 continued to operate after the disaster. This may seem astonishing, but it reflects the practical realities of the time. The Soviet Union, and then Ukraine, needed the electricity they generated. Shutting them down prematurely, before alternatives could be arranged, would have created significant economic and energy supply problems. Units 1 and 2 were shut down in the early 1990s. Unit 3 continued operating until December 15, 1999, more than 13 years after the disaster, when it was finally shut down as part of an agreement between Ukraine and international donors. Now let us talk about the health effects of the disaster, because this is an area of genuine complexity and genuine controversy, and it deserves careful and honest treatment. The immediate health effects were clear and devastating. 28 of the first responders died of acute radiation syndrome in the weeks following the disaster. 2 additional deaths occurred on the night of the explosion itself. 1 worker killed by the explosion directly, and 1 who died of a cardiac event in the immediate aftermath, possibly triggered by shock. These 30 deaths are considered the direct, immediate casualties of the accident, the people killed by the event itself in the traditional sense. Beyond this, the health effects of the disaster extend in several dimensions. The effects on plant workers and liquidators who received significant radiation doses, the effects on the populations of contaminated areas who received lower but still elevated doses over extended periods, and the psychological and social effects of displacement, fear, and disruption. Thyroid cancer is the most clearly established health consequence of the Chernobyl disaster in the general population. The radioactive iodine released during the accident was absorbed into the thyroid glands of people, particularly children, who consumed contaminated milk and food in the days following the explosion. Iodine 131 has a relatively short half-life, about 8 days, so it was most dangerous in the weeks immediately following the accident, when levels were highest. Children are particularly vulnerable because their thyroid glands are smaller and more metabolically active than those of adults, meaning they absorb proportionally more iodine. In the years following the disaster, rates of thyroid cancer among children in Ukraine and Belarus, the two most affected countries, rose dramatically. Thousands of cases have been diagnosed that are attributed to Chernobyl exposure. The good news, if there is good news in this part of the story, is that thyroid cancer is, with appropriate treatment, highly curable. The survival rate for thyroid cancer, caught and treated appropriately, is very high. The tragedies occur when access to diagnosis and treatment is inadequate, which it sometimes was, particularly in the economically chaotic 1990s in post-Soviet Ukraine and Belarus. Other health effects are harder to establish statistically. The World Health Organization, the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, and other authoritative bodies have, over the years, produced reports assessing the health consequences of Chernobyl. These reports have generally concluded that while the disaster caused a significant increase in thyroid cancer, the evidence for increased rates of other cancers in the general population is more limited and harder to establish definitively, given the statistical challenges of detecting relatively small increases in already common diseases against the background of a large population with many other risk factors. This conclusion has been disputed by some researchers and by many affected communities, who argue that the official bodies have underestimated the health consequences that the reality on the ground in the communities of Ukraine and Belarus shows patterns of illness that statistical analyses do not fully capture. This debate is genuine, and it has not been fully resolved. The difficulty of proving causal links between radiation exposure and health outcomes in a population exposed to many other factors simultaneously, with incomplete pre-disaster health data for comparison, in societies that went through enormous economic and social upheaval in the years following the disaster, is genuinely severe. What we can say with confidence is that the psychological and social impacts of the disaster were enormous and well documented. The populations displaced from the exclusion zone, more than 300,000 people eventually, across different waves of evacuation and resettlement, suffered the losses of home, community, livelihood, and identity that attend any mass displacement. Many were relocated to new areas where they were strangers, where their skills and occupations did not transfer easily, where they carried the social stigma that, in the Soviet and post-Soviet context, attached to being from the contaminated zone. The stigma was real and had real consequences. People from the affected areas found it difficult to find marriage partners. There were reports of families hiding Chernobyl connections to avoid the discrimination that the label carried. Workers from the zone found employment discrimination. Children faced social exclusion. The psychological burden of living under the cloud of invisible contamination, of not knowing what your dose had been, what it might mean for your health, what the future held, was crushing for many people. Studies of mental health in the affected populations found elevated rates of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress symptoms. The uncertainty itself, not knowing how sick you might become, not knowing if your children would develop cancers, not knowing if the symptoms you were experiencing were radiation-related or coincidental, was identified as a major driver of psychological distress, in some cases causing more measurable harm than the radiation itself. This is not a dismissal of the radiation's physical effects. It is an acknowledgement of a complex, multi-layered catastrophe in which the physical, psychological, social, and economic consequences were interwoven in ways that are difficult to separate and impossible to fully account for. Let us also spend a moment with the question of the environment, the natural world of the exclusion zone. In the years immediately following the evacuation, the forests in the most heavily contaminated areas around the reactor died. The trees in an area called the Red Forest, a stand of pine trees about 4 kilometers from the plant, directly in the path of the heaviest initial contamination, turned red and died within weeks of the accident. The dead trees were eventually bulldozed and buried, replaced by a landscape that looked stripped and scorched. But then something unexpected began to happen. Without human presence, without farms and roads and construction and hunting, the exclusion zone began to rewild itself. The forests grew back first with pioneer species, then with fuller woodland. The rivers and lakes, though still carrying elevated levels of radioactive contamination, teemed with fish. Birds returned, mammals returned, wolves, lynx, deer, wild boar, beavers, bears, animals that had been virtually absent from the intensely human-managed landscapes of Ukraine and Belarus, returned to the exclusion zone in numbers not seen in the region for decades or centuries. Studies of animal populations in the exclusion zone have found that, despite the radiation, the absence of humans has allowed wildlife to thrive in overall terms that comparison areas with human activity cannot match. The radiation causes documented effects in some species, elevated mutation rates in some plants and animals, reduced populations of some insects in the most heavily contaminated areas, documented reproductive problems in some bird species. These are real and measurable consequences. But the comparison that matters is not between the zone and an ideal, pristine environment. The comparison that matters is between the zone and the surrounding areas that remained under human land use, and by that comparison, the zone's wildlife is, in many measurable respects, doing better. The predators are back, the wetlands are intact, the old-growth forest patches that would have been cleared for agriculture are growing undisturbed. It is a strange and complicated testimony to human impact on the natural world that an area poisoned by the worst nuclear accident in history has, in the absence of its human inhabitants, become something resembling a wildlife haven. Nature is astonishingly resilient. It does not need us to flourish. It often flourishes more when we are absent. There are still people who live in the exclusion zone, it should be noted. A community of elderly residents, mostly women, mostly in their 80s and older by now, who refused to leave after the evacuation, or who returned in the years afterward, choosing to live out their remaining years in the villages where they were born and had spent their lives. These self-settlers, or samosli, as they were called in Ukrainian, numbered several hundred at their peak and have dwindled over the decades as their members have died of old age. Their story is one of the most quietly moving threads in the entire Chernobyl narrative. These were people, mostly older women, who looked at the choice between life in an unfamiliar resettlement apartment and life in their own home, in their own garden, tending their own livestock, and chose the familiar, even knowing or accepting or deciding not to care about the risks. Many of them lived well into old age in the zone. Some studies suggested their health was comparable to, or in some respects better than, evacuated populations of similar age, possibly because the psychological benefits of remaining in a known environment and maintaining an active, self-sufficient lifestyle outweighed the radiation risks for people who had already lived most of their lives. Chapter 5. Chernobyl Today: The Ghost, the Monument, and the Reckoning. We have come a long way together tonight, from the founding of Pripyat, through the long night of April 26th, through the heroism and suffering of the first responders and the liquidators, through the evacuation and the political reverberations, and the slow, painful accounting of health and environmental consequences. Now let us go to Chernobyl today, to what it looks like, what it feels like, and what it means to Ukraine, to the world, and to anyone who has ever contemplated what it means to live with the consequences of human decisions. The exclusion zone today is, in some respects, one of the most remarkable places in Europe. It covers approximately 2,600 square kilometers, roughly the size of the state of Rhode Island in the United States, or somewhat larger than Luxembourg. The outer boundary of the zone has shifted and adjusted over the decades, as monitoring data has improved understanding of exactly where contamination is elevated and where it is less so. Some areas that were originally excluded have been removed from the zone as levels have declined. Others remain strictly controlled. Within the zone, the landscape is a patchwork. There are areas of dense forest that have grown up to reclaim what were once fields and villages. There are areas of open wetland where beavers have built dams and created new ponds that did not exist before the disaster. There are the ruins of villages, dozens of them that stand in various states of decay, their wooden houses slowly collapsing under the weight of vegetation, their brick structures still standing but overgrown, their once tidy gardens returned to wilderness. And there is Pripyat. Pripyat today is perhaps the most photographed ghost city in the world. Since the mid-2000 years, and dramatically after the release of the HBO television miniseries Chernobyl in 2019, Pripyat has become a destination for what is called dark tourism, travel to places associated with tragedy, disaster, or death. Tour operators in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, offer day trips and multi-day excursions to the exclusion zone, and hundreds of thousands of visitors have made the trip over the years. What they find when they arrive in Pripyat is something that is, by most accounts, deeply and fundamentally unsettling. Not in an obviously dramatic way, the city is not burnt or bombed, not visibly destroyed in the way of a city damaged by conventional warfare. Its apartment buildings still stand. Its streets are still there, though cracked by decades of frost and seeded with trees growing up through the asphalt. Its schools, hospitals, cultural centre, cinema and amusement park are all still there. What makes it unsettling is what is still inside. Because the evacuation was so rapid, and because residents were told they would be returning in 3 days, they left almost everything behind. The apartments still contained furniture, dishes, books, children's toys, and family photographs. The schools still have desks and textbooks, the chalkboards still bearing, in some cases, the lessons that were interrupted on April 26th when the teachers received word that something had happened at the plant. The hospital still has medical equipment and patient records, and in its basement, the radioactive clothing and equipment of the first responders who were brought there on the night of the disaster, still stored in the same basement because it remains too contaminated to safely remove. The famous amusement park, the Ferris wheel, that is perhaps the single most iconic image associated with Chernobyl in popular culture, still stands. Its yellow gondolas frozen at various positions on the wheel, aging and rusting in the open air. The park was scheduled to open for the first time on May 1st, 1986, the May Day holiday. It opened 5 days too late, and it opened empty, briefly accessible to the workers managing the exclusion zone before being abandoned to the elements. The power of Pripyat as a place is the power of interrupted time. The city was not gradually abandoned. There was no slow decline, no incremental departure of residents as opportunities dried up and the young moved away. It was simply there, fully inhabited, and then suddenly, over the course of a single afternoon, it was not. Everything stopped at the same moment. And what was left behind is not ruins exactly, but a record of a life that was halted mid-sentence. Walking through Pripyat, at least for those who have done so and written about it, is like walking through a photograph that you can inhabit in 3 dimensions. The visual details are precise and overwhelming in their ordinariness. A pair of child's shoes on a classroom floor, a chess set on a table in the cultural centre, a baby stroller in a storage room, a piano in a community room, its keys still white, its wood still largely intact, though moisture and time have put it permanently out of tune. The amusement park Ferris wheel, the empty swimming pool of the Luzerny water park, the mosaic murals on the walls of public buildings, their Soviet-era imagery of workers and athletes and cosmonauts still vivid against the crumbling concrete, a gymnasium full of gas masks, which appeared at some point after the evacuation and gave rise to all manner of speculation about why they were there. The most prosaic explanation is that they were stored there as civil defense equipment rather than having any particular connection to the disaster. Visiting Pripyat requires a guide and involves signing liability waivers and following strict protocols about where you can go and what you can touch. Visitors are provided with dosimeters, and they are instructed to keep to designated paths, to avoid touching vegetation, to not pick up or move any objects. The radiation levels in most of the accessible areas of Pripyat are elevated above background levels, but for a brief visit are not considered seriously harmful. The cumulative dose from a typical tourist day trip is roughly equivalent to a few months of normal background radiation, or somewhat less than the dose from a long-haul transatlantic flight. The tourism to the zone, while economically beneficial for Ukraine and genuinely educational for many visitors, has also raised complicated questions. There is something uncomfortable about the spectacle of outsiders coming to photograph the remnants of what was, for the people who lived there, their home, the mementos of daily life that have become photogenic props for visitors, the toys, the shoes, the personal items belonged to real people who are still alive in many cases, who remember their apartment and their school and their city, and who sometimes find the touristic treatment of their former home a source of pain rather than interest. There have been debates within Ukraine about how to balance the legitimate interest in Chernobyl as a site of historical and educational significance with respect for the human dimension of what happened there. These debates are ongoing and have no easy resolution. Now let us talk about the structure that replaced the sarcophagus, because this is one of the most impressive engineering stories of the 21st century, and it is not as widely known as it deserves to be. By the early 2000s, the original sarcophagus that had been hastily constructed in 1986 was in serious condition. Decades of exposure to the elements, combined with the structural compromises inherent in building something so quickly under such conditions, had left it weakened and cracked. There were genuine fears about its stability, fears that sections of the roof might collapse, that a new release of radioactive dust into the environment might result. The sarcophagus had never been intended as a permanent solution, and its time as even an adequate temporary one was running out. The international community, through a framework called the Shelter Implementation Plan, had been working since the 1990s to develop a better solution. What emerged was an audacious project, a completely new structure, large enough to enclose the original sarcophagus entirely, that would be built off-site and then slid into position on enormous rails. This new structure, called the New Safe Confinement, was designed to last for at least 100 years, providing a stable enclosure within which the eventual decommissioning of the destroyed reactor could eventually be safely carried out. The New Safe Confinement is an extraordinary structure. It is approximately 162 meters tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty from base to torch. It is 257 meters wide. It is an arch shape, enormous and gleaming, made of steel and clad in metal panels. When slid over the old sarcophagus, it completely enclosed the entire structure. The construction of the New Safe Confinement was a major international engineering project involving companies from across Europe and funded by an international consortium of more than 45 countries. It was built in two halves, side by side. Each half assembled a safe distance from the reactor and then brought together before the completed arch was slid into its final position on rails in November of 2016, 30 years after the disaster. The sliding of the arch into position was, by the accounts of those who witnessed it, a genuinely moving event. This extraordinary feat of engineering, funded by the international community, built by European firms, designed to protect future generations from the consequences of an event that happened more than 3 decades earlier, it represented, in its way, something hopeful. An acknowledgement that the problem was real, that it required serious resources and serious ingenuity, and that the international community was capable, at least in this case, of setting aside differences and cooperating on something that mattered. The New Safe Confinement was officially inaugurated on July 29, 2019. It is designed to allow, eventually, for the remotely operated decommissioning of the reactor interior, the removal and safe disposal of the remaining fuel and structural material, over a process that will take many decades. The full decommissioning of the Chernobyl site is not expected to be complete until at least 2065 and possibly much later. Now, let us talk briefly about the role that Chernobyl has played and continues to play in the global conversation about nuclear power. The Chernobyl disaster profoundly and lastingly shaped public opinion about nuclear energy. In many countries, especially in Western Europe, the response to the disaster was an immediate and significant turn against nuclear power. West Germany, Austria, Denmark, and other nations either abandoned plans for nuclear development or actively began phasing out existing nuclear plants in the years following 1986. The accident gave an enormous boost to anti-nuclear movements that had been growing throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, and provided concrete, visceral justification for the fears they had been expressing. In the United States, which had its own partial nuclear meltdown at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania in 1979, Chernobyl confirmed and deepened public skepticism of nuclear power that had been growing through the late 1970s and early 1980s. No new nuclear power plants were ordered in the United States in the years following Chernobyl. Many plants that had been under construction were cancelled. The American nuclear industry went into a decades-long period of effective stagnation. The effect on global nuclear policy was significant. Reactor safety standards were tightened. The RBMK design's flaws were addressed. The graphite tip problem of the control rods was modified in the remaining RBMK reactors. The positive void coefficient was partially addressed through changes in fuel enrichment, though RBMK reactors remained in operation in Russia for many years after the disaster, and some are still operating today, though much modified. International cooperation on nuclear safety was strengthened, with new frameworks developed under the International Atomic Energy Agency for sharing safety information and conducting peer reviews of nuclear facilities. In the Soviet Union and its successor states, the effect was even more direct. The Soviet nuclear program essentially froze after Chernobyl. Plants under construction were halted. Plans for new plants were shelved. The enormous expansion of nuclear capacity that Soviet planners had envisioned for the 1990s and beyond simply did not happen. Today, as the world grapples with the challenge of climate change and the urgent need to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from energy production, the nuclear question has returned in a new form. Nuclear power produces electricity without directly emitting carbon dioxide, making it, in the view of many climate scientists and policy analysts, a potentially important part of any serious effort to decarbonize the electricity sector. A new generation of reactor designs, many of them fundamentally different from the RBMK, designed with inherent safety features that make accidents like Chernobyl physically impossible, has been developed and, in some cases, is beginning to be built. The ghost of Chernobyl haunts this debate. Public opinion surveys consistently show that fear of nuclear accidents remains one of the primary reasons for public opposition to nuclear power, and Chernobyl, along with the Fukushima Daiichi accident in Japan in 2011, is consistently cited as a reason for that fear. The task of nuclear advocates and of policymakers who must navigate public opinion is partly a task of communicating accurately about what happened at Chernobyl, what the actual consequences were, and what has changed in nuclear technology and safety culture in the decades since. This is genuinely complicated because Chernobyl involves real and serious consequences that should not be minimized. and also involves significant misunderstanding and exaggeration that distorts policy debate. The truth, as is so often the case, is somewhere between the extremes of nuclear power kills everyone who gets near it and Chernobyl was basically harmless. The truth requires engagement with actual data, with genuine uncertainty, and with the complexity of comparing different kinds of risks and different kinds of consequences. What happened on April 26, 1986 was a genuine catastrophe. 30 people died in the immediate aftermath from acute radiation syndrome. Thousands developed thyroid cancer, the vast majority of whom survived with treatment, but some of whom did not. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced from their homes, permanently in most cases. Enormous economic damage was done to the region and to the Soviet state. The natural environment of a large area was contaminated with radioactive material that will persist in some form for centuries. These are real consequences. They deserve acknowledgement and respect, and the people who lived them deserve to have their experience accurately represented, not minimized in the service of any political argument. At the same time, the Chernobyl disaster has also been surrounded by myths and misrepresentations that have their own consequences. The belief that the disaster created a vast zone of death populated by grotesquely mutated animals, a popular image in fiction and in some journalism, is not accurate. The belief that the entire exclusion zone is uniformly lethal to humans who enter it, also not accurate. The belief that the disaster killed hundreds of thousands of people directly, the actual evidence, does not support that number, though establishing accurate long-term mortality estimates is genuinely difficult. Accuracy matters, not to minimize what happened, but because inaccurate understanding of nuclear risks leads to inaccurate policy decisions. And in a world where both climate change and energy security are pressing concerns, accurate understanding of nuclear risks and nuclear risks in context is genuinely important. In 2022, Chernobyl became part of a story that no one who cared about the site had anticipated. In the early hours of February 24th, 2022, Russian military forces crossed into Ukraine as part of a massive invasion that began the largest conventional war in Europe since the Second World War. One of the routes of the Russian advance toward Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, passed directly through the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Russian forces occupied the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and the surrounding area on February 24th, 2022, taking staff hostage and assuming control of the facility. The staff, the engineers and workers responsible for monitoring the site and maintaining the safety systems were detained and forced to work under armed guard. Ukrainian authorities lost contact with the monitoring systems that track radiation levels in the zone. During the Russian occupation, which lasted until late March of 2022, when Russian forces withdrew from the area, there were alarming reports of soldiers digging trenches in the Red Forest, the most contaminated area adjacent to the plant, without adequate protective equipment, exposing themselves to radioactive soil. There were reports of Russian soldiers who were later observed to be suffering symptoms of radiation exposure, though the full medical accounting of this has not been comprehensively reported. The intrusion of an active shooting war into a site as sensitive as Chernobyl added a dimension of danger to an already catastrophic situation. Ukrainian and international nuclear experts expressed serious concern about the safety of the monitoring systems. the integrity of the waste storage facilities at the site, and the welfare of the detained staff. The situation was a stark reminder that the Chernobyl site is not a closed chapter of history. It is an ongoing responsibility requiring continuous attention, management, and resources, and it is vulnerable to the full spectrum of human disorder that the rest of the world is also vulnerable to. Ukrainian forces retook control of the Chernobyl site and surrounding area in late March of 2022. The staff returned to normal operations. Monitoring systems were re-established. The new safe confinement remained intact, but the episode served as a sobering reminder that the site's future is inseparable from the future of Ukraine itself and from the broader stability and security of the region. Ukraine, it is worth noting, has a complicated and evolving relationship with the Chernobyl legacy. The disaster happened when Ukraine was a republic within the Soviet Union, and many Ukrainians feel that their country bore a disproportionate burden of the disaster, while Soviet, essentially Russian-dominated decision-making had been responsible for the circumstances that made it possible. The management of information in the early days of the disaster, information that was withheld not only from the world but from the Ukrainian people themselves, is a source of lasting grievance. Since Ukrainian independence in 1991, the country has made Chernobyl a site of national memory and, increasingly, of national identity. The Chernobyl Museum in Kyiv, established in 1992, is one of the most visited museums in the country. The annual commemorations of the disaster on April 26th are significant national events. Ukrainian political leaders regularly invoke Chernobyl as part of a narrative of national suffering and resilience. UNESCO designated the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone as a World Heritage Site in 2023, recognizing it as a site of exceptional historical and cultural significance. This designation reflects a broader international acknowledgement that Chernobyl is not merely a Ukrainian or a Soviet story. It is a story that belongs to human civilization, a record of what can happen when the immense power of the atom meets the very human capacities for overconfidence, institutional failure, and the subordination of safety to other priorities. The museum in Kyiv, which we might linger on for a moment as we move toward the close of our journey tonight, is a thoughtful and moving institution. Its exhibits walk visitors through the history of nuclear power in the Soviet Union, the events of April 1986, the evacuation and the liquidator operations, and the long-term consequences for the affected populations. It preserves records, photographs, and artifacts from the disaster and its aftermath. It tells the stories of the first responders and the liquidators with care and specificity, individual people with names and faces and histories, rather than an undifferentiated mass of victims. The museum's approach reflects something important about how Chernobyl is best understood, not as an abstraction, not as a set of statistics, not as a symbol for whatever political or policy argument one wants to make, but as a human story, a story of specific people in specific circumstances, making specific decisions, living with specific consequences. A story of a city that existed, full of life and ordinary human complication, and then was emptied. A story of people who went to help and paid with their health and their lives. A story of families separated, communities dissolved, landscapes transformed. And also because this, too, is part of the truth, a story of remarkable human capability, the engineering accomplishment of the new safe confinement, the logistical achievement of evacuating nearly 50,000 people in an afternoon, the scientific effort to understand and document the disaster's consequences over decades, the political achievement of assembling an international coalition to fund and build a structure to protect the site for the next century, the quiet heroism of the liquidators who cleaned contaminated roads with inadequate equipment because someone had to, the firefighters who climbed onto radioactive rooftops because a fire needed to be fought, the helicopter pilots who flew over an open reactor core because someone needed to drop sand on it. Human beings, at their worst and at their best, are both present in this story. That is, in many ways, what makes it so enduring, so powerful, so worth knowing. And so, as we come to the end of our time together tonight, let us take a final, quiet moment to sit with what this story is really about. It is about the relationship between human ambition and human limitation. The ambition that built the first nuclear reactors, that generated electricity from the atom, that raised cities in empty forests and imagined a future powered by the power of the sun that was a real ambition, and in many ways a noble one. The desire to provide light and warmth and modern life to people who had lived without them, that is not a small thing. And the limitation, the tendency to build institutions that punish honesty, to design systems that prioritize output over safety, to assume that because something has not gone wrong, it will not go wrong, to allow the political needs of the moment to override the physical realities that do not care about political needs, that is also real and also human, and not in any way unique to the Soviet Union. Chernobyl is sometimes presented as a story about the failures of Soviet communism specifically, and those failures were real and they matter. But it would be a comfortable mistake, a self-serving mistake, to conclude that the lesson of Chernobyl applies only to one political system, one historical period, one set of people in one country who happened to build the wrong kind of reactor in the wrong kind of institutional environment. The pressures that led to Chernobyl, the pressure to meet targets, to not report bad news, to keep going when stopping would be inconvenient, to prioritize the appearance of safety over its substance, are not unique to Soviet communism. They are features of large bureaucratic institutions everywhere, in any political system, at any time. The engineers and managers who made the decisions that led to April 26th were not villains. They were people, shaped by their environment and their incentives, doing what their environment and their incentives rewarded them for doing. The reactor design was flawed, and the flaw was known, and the flaw was not widely communicated. That is a failure of institutional information management. The safety margins were violated, and the violations were permitted because the test schedule was important. That is a failure of institutional culture. The radiation readings were underreported in the early hours, and as a result, the response was too slow. That is a failure of a system that made honest reporting dangerous. None of these failures are alien to us. None of them are safely historical. They live in organizations and institutions and bureaucracies everywhere, right now, in the present day. The question Chernobyl asks of us is not just how did the Soviets manage to blow up a nuclear reactor? The question Chernobyl asks of us is, what are the flaws in the systems we rely on that we are not talking about, that we have documented somewhere and not widely communicated, that we know about but have decided are manageable, that we are hoping will remain theoretical, that is a question without a comfortable answer. It is a question that deserves to be asked anyway. Chernobyl is many things. A ghost city, a wildlife refuge, a monument to human error and human courage, a chapter in the history of the Cold War, a cautionary tale, a tourist destination, a symbol, a responsibility that will persist for centuries. And it is also always a place, a specific place in a specific landscape, the flat, forested country of northern Ukraine, where the Pripyat River flows through wetlands and the trees grow tall and dense, and the seasons come and go with indifference to the human dramas that have played out beneath them. In that landscape, right now, as you listen to these words, the wolves are running through what were once the streets of evacuation villages. The forest is growing through the floors of abandoned houses. The Ferris wheel in the Pripyat amusement park is standing still under a sky that has turned, as all Ukrainian skies eventually do, to either rain or stars. And the new safe confinement, that enormous silver arch, is sitting over the ruins of Unit 4, doing quietly and continuously and without drama the work it was built to do, keeping something contained that needs to be contained, for as long as anything made by human hands can be kept going in a world that is always, eventually, subject to revision. That is the story of Chernobyl. Complex, tragic, human, and ongoing. Thank you for staying with it all the way to the end. This has been Sleepless History. If this episode found you on your way to sleep, I hope the journey we took together tonight through the forests of Ukraine, through the control rooms, and the burning reactor, and the ghost city, and the years of consequence brought you something worth carrying, knowledge perhaps, or simply the comfort of a long, detailed story told at the pace the night deserves. Sleep well.